Enuma Elish, long before the words "in the beginning" were ever written in Hebrew, long before Genesis became the foundation of monotheistic belief, the people of Mesopotamia were already telling a story about how the world began. This was not a marginal myth whispered at the edges of society. It was recited publicly during the Babylonian New Year festival. It was inscribed on clay tablets. It was preserved in royal archives. It shaped how an entire civilization understood the structure of reality. The text is known today as the Enuma Elish. Its name comes from its opening line, "When on high the heavens had not yet been named." The story does not begin with a single eternal creator. It begins with waters, primordial waters. Apsu, representing fresh water, and Tiamat, representing salt water. Their mingling generates the first generation of gods. Creation emerges from mixture, from tension, from interaction. There is no absolute order in the beginning. There is movement, sound, disturbance. The younger gods become restless. Their activity irritates Apsu, who decides they must be destroyed to restore silence. But one of them, Ea, discovers the plan and kills Apsu first. This act does not bring peace. It escalates conflict. Tiamat responds with fury. She creates monstrous beings. She appoints King as her champion and prepares for cosmic war. At this moment, a new figure rises, Marduk. Marduk agrees to fight Tiamat under one condition. If he wins, he must be granted supreme authority over all. Power in this narrative is not eternal. It is achieved through victory. The battle that follows is violent and symbolic. Marduk defeats Tiamat, splits her body in two, and from her divided form constructs the universe. One half becomes the sky, the other becomes the earth. He establishes constellations, fixes the movement of celestial bodies, organizes time itself. Order is born from the body of chaos. This is not merely mythology, it is political theology. Babylon rises to dominance, and its god rises with it. Divine hierarchy mirrors imperial hierarchy. The cosmos reflects the empire. Then humanity appears. Humans are created from the blood of King, the defeated rebel. Their purpose is explicit: to serve the gods, to build temples, to perform rituals, to maintain divine order. Humanity exists to relieve the gods of labor. Now pause. This narrative predates the composition of Genesis by centuries. It circulated widely across the ancient Near East. It defined how creation, authority, and purpose were understood in Mesopotamia. And yet when we open Genesis, something feels both familiar and radically different. There is water. There is separation. There is structure. But there is no war. No divine negotiation. No violent overthrow. Instead of gods emerging from chaos, there is one voice speaking into it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice the deeper pattern. In Enuma Elish, the world is organized only after a struggle for authority. The right to rule is earned through conquest, and once Marduk becomes supreme, the universe becomes centralized, standardized, measurable. The sky is mapped, time is regulated, names are assigned, hierarchy becomes law. That idea would have sounded familiar to anyone living under an empire, because empires do the same thing. They conquer, they rename, they measure, they organize. They turned diversity into a single system. So when Israelite writers later shaped Genesis, they were not writing in a vacuum. Many scholars connect key stages of biblical composition and editing to periods of contact with Mesopotamian culture, especially during exile. When your identity is threatened, origin stories become a declaration. This is who we are, and this is who our God is. And that may explain why Genesis reads like an answer. It takes the shared ancient imagery, waters, darkness, separation, heavens and earth, and strips away the Babylonian political message. No council of gods, no bargaining for power, no cosmic monsters that must be killed to create order. Creation is not the aftermath of violence, it is the result of intention. Even the role of humanity changes. In Enuma Elish, humans exist to serve the gods like workers serving a palace. In Genesis, humans are given a different status, responsibility over the earth. Purpose becomes stewardship, not forced labor. In the next part, we'll read Genesis with this in mind and ask, is Genesis simply copying Mesopotamia, or is it rewriting it on purpose? Genesis, a different kind of creation. When we turn to Genesis chapter 1, we enter a world that feels familiar yet profoundly transformed. The opening line is simple, almost restrained. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's no genealogy of gods, no primordial battle, no negotiation of power. The text begins with sovereignty already established, but notice something important. The earth is described as formless and void, and darkness covers the face of the deep. The Hebrew word used for the deep is tehom. Many scholars have pointed out that tehom sounds remarkably similar to Tiamat, the chaos goddess of the Enuma Elish. Is that coincidence? Possibly. But the parallel is difficult to ignore. In both accounts, creation begins with water and chaos. Yet what happens next reveals the theological shift. In Genesis, there is no combat, no divine violence, no cosmic corpse split apart to build the sky. Instead, there is speech. And God said, creation unfolds through language. Light is not wrestled from chaos. It is spoken into existence. Separation becomes the key action. Light from darkness, waters above from waters below, sea from dry land. Order emerges not through domination, but through structuring. This difference is crucial. In Mesopotamia, order is the result of victory. In Genesis, order is the result of intention. There is no divine council debating authority. There is no challenge to God's rule. Power is not earned, it is inherent. Even the structure of Genesis reflects precision. 6 days of ordered formation, a progression from environment to inhabitant. Light before luminaries, sky and sea before birds and fish, land before animals and humanity. The cosmos is not assembled from a slain deity. It is arranged with deliberate symmetry. Then comes humanity. In the Enuma Elish, humans are created from the blood of Kingu, the defeated rebel. Their role is labor. They exist to relieve the gods of work. In Genesis, humanity is described differently. Let us make mankind in our image. The phrase image of God has enormous implications. In the ancient Near East, only kings were described as bearing divine image. In Genesis, that status is extended to all humanity. This is radical. Human beings are not servants formed from the remains of rebellion. They are representatives of divine authority. Their task is not temple maintenance for divine rest. Their task is stewardship. They are told to cultivate, to govern responsibly, to care. Even rest changes meaning. In Enuma Elish, the gods create humans so they can finally rest from labor. In Genesis, God rests not from exhaustion, but as a declaration that creation is complete and ordered. The seventh day becomes sacred, not because the gods are tired, but because order has been established. So what are we seeing on the surface? Similar imagery: waters, separation, structure, humanity's creation. Beneath the surface, a complete theological reorientation. Genesis removes divine conflict. It removes polytheistic hierarchy. It removes violence as the engine of order. Instead, it presents a universe grounded in coherence. The ancient Israelite authors were not unaware of Mesopotamian myth. They lived in its shadow, especially during the Babylonian exile, when Jewish elites were immersed in the intellectual world of Mesopotamia. But Genesis does not read like a copy. It reads like a response. It takes familiar cosmological language and strips it of its imperial message. There is no Marduk demanding supremacy. There is no chaos goddess slain to secure order. There is one God, already sovereign, shaping reality through word. And that shift changes everything, because in this narrative, power does not arise from conquest, it arises from intention. In the next part, we will place these two creation accounts side by side and ask a deeper question. Are these similarities evidence of borrowing, shared culture, or deliberate theological opposition? The answer is more complex than either simple copying or complete independence. Parallels, patterns, and purpose. Now that we have examined both narratives separately, we must place them side by side, not emotionally, not defensively, but structurally, because structure reveals intention. At first glance, the similarities are undeniable. Both accounts begin with waters. Both describe a formless beginning. Both move towards separation, sky from earth, waters divided. Both culminate in a structured cosmos. Both place humanity near the end of the process. These are not vague thematic overlaps. They are pattern developments. But similarity does not automatically mean imitation. Ancient cultures shared geography, trade routes, political influence, and exile experiences. Ideas traveled with merchants, with captives, with diplomats. Cosmological language was part of the intellectual air of the region. The real question is not whether Genesis knew Mesopotamian myth. The real question is what Genesis does with it. Look closely at the theme of chaos. In Enuma Elish, chaos is personified. It has a name, Tiamat. It must be confronted, battled, defeated. Order is the result of divine violence. In Genesis, chaos is impersonal. The deep is present, but it is not an enemy. It does not resist. It does not speak. It is simply unformed matter awaiting structure. There is no struggle. This absence is intentional. Genesis removes the cosmic battlefield. In Mesopotamia, authority emerges through conquest. In Genesis, authority precedes creation. There is no moment where God earns the right to rule. He simply speaks. Then consider the celestial bodies. In Enuma Elish, the stars and constellations are established as part of Marduk's ordering of time and kingship. In Mesopotamian religion, celestial bodies were often deified or closely associated with divine beings. In Genesis, the sun and moon are not even named. They are called the greater light and the lesser light. The text avoids the names commonly associated with deities in surrounding cultures. This is subtle but powerful. The author appears to demythologize the sky. What other cultures worship, Genesis reduces to function. Lights to govern day and night, nothing more. Then there is humanity. In Enuma Elish, humans are created from the blood of a rebel god. Their purpose is service. Their existence is rooted in conflict. In Genesis, humanity is created peacefully. No divine blood, no violence. They are given dignity, purpose, and relational language. The difference in anthropology reflects a difference in theology. Mesopotamian myth reinforces hierarchy. Gods above, humans below. Labor sustains the divine order. Genesis flattens the hierarchy. There is still sovereignty, but humanity participates in divine purpose rather than simply relieving divine burden. Now consider another layer. The Enuma Elish is recited to celebrate Babylon's supremacy. It is tied to empire. Genesis, by contrast, emerges most clearly in periods when Israel lacked political power, especially during exile. This matters. When a conquered people writes about creation, their story becomes resistance. If Babylon claims Marduk defeated chaos and rules the cosmos, Genesis responds, no, there is one God, and he does not need to fight for authority. If Babylon's myth justifies empire, Genesis decentralizes it. It shifts cosmic legitimacy away from political dominance and toward moral and relational order. This is not passive borrowing. This is theological reframing. But there is also humility required here. Shared imagery suggests shared cultural memory. The ancient Near East did not produce isolated mythologies. Ideas evolved through interaction. Genesis is neither an isolated miracle of originality nor simple plagiarism. It is a transformation. It speaks the language of its world, but with a new accent. It retains structure while removing violence. It retains sequence while removing rivalry. It retains cosmic order while removing divine competition. And that transformation reveals something deeper than copying. It reveals intention. In the next part, we will examine the flood narrative, because if the creation parallels are striking, the flood parallels are even more precise. And there, the question of influence becomes even more complex. The flood, shared memory or shared myth. If the creation narratives raise questions of influence, the flood narratives intensify them. Because here the parallels are not only thematic, they are structural. Long before the story of Noah was written in Hebrew, a flood story circulated across Mesopotamia. It appears in multiple forms, but the most well-known version is preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In that account, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that the divine council has decided to destroy humanity with a flood. The reason varies slightly depending on the version. Sometimes humanity is too noisy, sometimes too numerous, but the decision is clear. Destruction is coming. Utnapishtim is instructed to build a large vessel. He seals it with pitch. He brings his family aboard. He loads animals onto the ship. The flood arrives. The waters cover the land. After days of chaos, the storm subsides. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are released to test whether the waters have receded. A sacrifice is offered, and divine regret follows. Now compare this with Genesis. God sees corruption and violence filling the earth. The decision to send a flood is framed not as irritation, but as a moral judgment. Noah is chosen because he is described as righteous. He's given specific instructions for building an ark. It is sealed with pitch. He brings his family. He gathers animals. The waters rise. The ark rests on a mountain. Birds are released, a raven, then a dove. The dove returns with an olive leaf. A sacrifice is offered, and God establishes a covenant. The parallels are undeniable. Structure, sequence, details. Even small narrative beats align. So what are we looking at? Coincidence seems unlikely. Independent invention seems improbable. The more reasonable explanation is that both stories draw from a shared cultural tradition rooted in Mesopotamia. But this does not end the discussion, because once again, Genesis does not merely repeat, it reshapes. In the Mesopotamian version, the gods regret the flood because they grow hungry without human offerings. Their sorrow is self-interested. In Genesis, divine regret is framed morally. The problem is not noise, it is corruption. In Mesopotamia, multiple gods debate and disagree. In Genesis, one god acts. In Gilgamesh, the survivor is granted immortality, but humanity remains unchanged. In Genesis, the flood leads to covenant, a promise symbolized by a rainbow. A new moral framework, the flood becomes not only destruction, but reset and responsibility. So again, we see a pattern. Genesis inherits narrative structure, but transforms theological meaning. It removes divine rivalry. It removes arbitrary destruction. It replaces divine caprice with moral coherence. This suggests something important. The authors of Genesis were not attempting to erase the flood tradition. They were participating in it, but they were also redefining it. If the Babylonian flood story functioned within a polytheistic worldview shaped by divine conflict, Genesis reframed the same narrative within monotheism. Shared memory does not mean identical theology. Cultures often preserve traumatic events through myth. Flooding was common in the Tigris-Euphrates region. Catastrophic floods would have left deep collective memory. It is possible that an ancient flood event inspired multiple retellings, but how that memory is interpreted reveals each culture's understanding of power, justice, and divinity. In Mesopotamia, divine authority is unstable and divided. In Genesis, divine authority is singular and morally grounded. This matters because the flood parallels demonstrate that Genesis is not isolated. Scripture dropped from heaven into a cultural vacuum. It is a text born within the ancient Near Eastern world. It speaks its language, but it redirects its meaning. In the next part, we will confront the central question directly. Does this mean Genesis copied Mesopotamian myth, or does it reveal something more nuanced about how traditions evolve, adapt, and redefine inherited narratives? The answer requires intellectual honesty and careful distinction between influence and identity. Borrowing, influence, or theological response. At this point, the question can no longer be avoided. If Genesis shares structure with Mesopotamian creation and flood narratives, what does that actually mean? Was Genesis copied? Was it influenced? Or was it something else entirely, a deliberate theological response shaped within the same cultural world? To answer responsibly, we must avoid extremes. The first extreme claims complete independence. It insists Genesis emerged in isolation, untouched by surrounding cultures. Historically, this is difficult to defend. Ancient Israel did not exist in a vacuum. It traded, fought, negotiated, and eventually experienced exile in Babylon. Intellectual exchange was inevitable. The second extreme claims simple plagiarism, that Genesis is merely a rewritten Babylonian myth with new names attached. But this too collapses under scrutiny. The theological differences are too consistent, too systematic, too intentional to be accidental edits. So what remains? Influence without surrender, shared imagery without shared theology, cultural conversation rather than cultural copying. Ancient authors did not think in terms of copyright. They inherited narrative frameworks and reshaped them to express identity. Storytelling was not about originality in the modern sense, it was about meaning. When Israelite writers encountered Mesopotamian cosmology, they did not reject its language entirely. Instead, they restructured it. They removed divine warfare. They removed competing gods. They removed cosmic violence as the foundation of order. And in doing so, they made a statement. In Mesopotamia, order is achieved through conquest. In Genesis, order is established through word. In Mesopotamia, humans serve to relieve divine burden. In Genesis, humans reflect divine image. In Mesopotamia, the flood expresses divine frustration. In Genesis, the flood expresses moral judgment and covenant. These are not small edits. They are theological reversals. The most plausible historical context for this transformation is the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. When Jerusalem fell and its temple was destroyed, Jewish elites were taken into Babylonian territory. They lived inside the empire that celebrated Marduk's supremacy. Imagine hearing the Enuma Elish recited while your own temple lay in ruins. Genesis, in that context, reads not as imitation but as resistance. It declares that Babylon's God is not the architect of the cosmos. It asserts that creation does not require violence. It insists that authority is not secured by battle. It reframes cosmic origins as morally coherent and unified. This does not weaken Genesis. It situates it. It shows that Scripture emerges within history, within culture, within dialogue. The power of Genesis may lie precisely in this transformation. It takes shared ancient imagery and infuses it with radical monotheism. It takes chaos and removes its personality. It takes violence and replaces it with speech. It takes hierarchy and replaces it with relational purpose. That is not copying. That is reinterpretation. And reinterpretation is how traditions survive. But there is another layer. Recognizing cultural influence does not diminish faith unless faith depends on isolation. If truth cannot exist within history, then history becomes threatening. But if revelation can occur within culture through language people understand, then influence becomes a vehicle rather than a threat. Genesis does not need to be ahistorical to be meaningful. It needs to be understood in its world. And once understood in its world, its distinctiveness becomes even clearer. In the final part, we'll step back and ask what this relationship between Mesopotamia and Genesis ultimately reveals, not only about ancient texts, but about how human beings construct meaning, identity, and belief. What this really means after walking through Enuma Elish, Genesis, and the flood narratives, we arrive at a moment that demands clarity. What does all of this actually mean? It does not mean that Genesis is a simple copy of Mesopotamian myth. It does not mean that Israel invented nothing new, and it does not mean that faith collapses under historical awareness. What it reveals is something far more complex and far more human. Ancient civilizations did not operate in sealed cultural containers. They shared geography, they shared trade routes, they shared political upheaval. And when empires rose and fell, stories traveled with them. Creation narratives were not written in silence. They were written in dialogue. When the Israelites shaped Genesis, they were not pretending Mesopotamian myth did not exist. They were answering it. The ancient world asked a fundamental question: how does order emerge from chaos? Mesopotamia answered through divine struggle. Genesis answered through divine will. Mesopotamia described a cosmos stabilized by violence and hierarchy. Genesis described a cosmos structured by intention and coherence. Both narratives attempt to explain the same existential mystery. Why is there something rather than nothing? But they explain it differently, and that difference is the key. In Enuma Elish, power is negotiated. Authority must be secured through the conflict. Humanity is secondary, functional, necessary for divine maintenance. In Genesis, authority precedes conflict. There is no divine threat. Humanity is not accidental labor. It is entrusted responsibility. The shift from polytheistic rivalry to unified monotheism is not a minor adjustment. It is a radical reimagining of reality. But this reimagining did not occur in a vacuum. It happened within exile, within exposure, within cultural confrontation. And that may be precisely why it carries such power. Because belief is often sharpened in crisis. When identity is threatened, origin stories become declarations. Genesis, in that sense, may be less about copying Babylon and more about redefining it. It takes the shared cosmological language of the ancient Near East and removes its imperial undertone. It denies that creation requires bloodshed. It denies that the universe rests upon the corpse of a defeated goddess. It denies that divine authority is unstable. Instead, it presents a world in which order flows from singular intention. Whether one approaches these texts as sacred scripture or historical literature, their relationship tells us something essential about human meaning-making. We inherit narratives, we reshape them, we reinterpret them to reflect who we believe we are. The presence of Mesopotamian influence does not reduce Genesis to myth. It situates it within history. And history does not weaken significance, it deepens it. Because now we see that the question was never simply who created the world. The deeper question was always what kind of power rules it? Is it chaotic and competitive, or unified and purposeful? Is order achieved through violence or through intention? Those ancient authors were not merely recording cosmology, they were defining reality. And perhaps that is why these texts still matter. Not because they provide scientific explanation, not because they eliminate doubt, but because they confront us with a choice. When we describe our origins, what are we really describing? A universe born from conflict or a universe shaped by meaning? The answer shapes everything that follows, and that is why the conversation between Enuma Elish and Genesis is not a threat to faith. It is a window into how belief evolves, clarifies, and declares itself within history. The story of creation in every culture is ultimately a story about authority. And authority, whether divine or human, defines the world we build.